Hi, I want to point out three subjects often forgotten in the discussion around Ukraine. Some will go your way and some not, but please bear with me. First of all, European and US guilt does not excuse Russia's actions. I can fill an encyclopedia, literally, with the massacres and terrors inflicted by the European colonialism and imperialism. No sensible and educated person would deny these facts of history. To this day, corporate greed and national interest mingle with politics and enable the worst: exploitation, tyranny, and war. Still, there is one substantial difference between the democratic world, or what we call the West, as a vestige of the Cold War, and all the autocracies and dictatorships. Real democracies have division of power, strong and independent from one another institutions, both public and private, independent media, independent scientific research centers, syndicates, trade unions. All of those are protected by the law, which is enforced by the executive power, not undermined by it, like in any good old dictatorship. Creating a mafia-like system inside a democracy is next to impossible, as no two interests align. Too many people voice their concern and expose corruption. Also, people who fight for a free world will often risk their lives because they believe in certain values. People motivated by greed or fear will not do so. They will try to hide and flee when the situation gets tough. So, did the West enable and even finance Putin's madness? In many ways, it did, mainly by ignoring what is happening for the sake of cheap energy bills, and by being too naive that Russia can become a democracy only by integrating it into the world's market. But believing that the Russian mafia was purposefully created and its wars planned by the West for profit is pure delusion. It is equally delusional to believe the endless gaslighting of Russian propaganda, always projecting on the West what they have done or intend to do, even though all the independent observers on the ground report otherwise. In summary, democracies are messy, have elements of corruption and shady pasts, but they expose their own bad actors. That's why you know about corporate corruption, about corrupted officials and CEOs, because there were people to tell you about them. And this is also why democracies appear weak, hesitant, and indecisive. All of their constituent parts must agree. What you should look out for is someone pretending he knows it all and can solve it all. Sounds familiar? That's how dictators are born. Economy, finances, politics are like languages. No one single person has the knowledge to make it all work. No committee sat down and built the English language. It has evolved through time with the input of millions. It's the same for our financial and political system. Too many variables are present to be controlled by a single mind, and too many actors are present to be paid off or threatened to corrupt them. Think of it like blockchain. The power of blockchain, the technology behind cryptocurrencies, is that information and keys are stored all around the world on millions of computers. You cannot own it all or alter it all. Second, our actions play a vital role. My purpose is to give context and perspective. I hope to act as a depolarizing agent so that we can all use our better judgment to assess our world and advance together toward the values that we all agree on: peace, human rights, free speech, free trade, free movement. In this case, it also means that we must acknowledge not only the Russian government's aggression, but also the enablers of it. I stand firmly behind these principles of democracy and the Western values, but to do so, I also believe that taking responsibility is key to evolving in the right direction. So, no matter if you're pro-Russian or pro-European, you will hear some disturbing facts. I believe that to avoid history repeating itself, each and every one of us must comprehend that his or her voice and actions matter. None of us, except a very few people corrupted by greed or driven mad by the centralized power given to them, act motivated by pure evil. There are no orcs and elves. The world is not divided into good and bad people. Most of us want the exact same things. The worst actions taken are often the result of either false information or the feeling that we're powerless. If I believe that nothing depends on me, then I can ignore the world around me and make myself available to be manipulated and perhaps not cause directly, but enable suffering and misery. As the famous Albert Einstein quote goes, the world will not be destroyed by those who do evil, but by those who watch them without doing anything. Make no mistake, the division of opinions that you see all around you is not about what we want. As I said earlier, I bet that we all want to live in peace, have human rights, be able to speak freely, trade and travel. The ideological difference of how we perceive the world is between delusion and reality, between those who prefer being the victim, rejecting truth and facts, believing in huge conspiracies, shadow governments, evil corporations, and those who want to take responsibility and act. To do so is a hard job. You must educate yourself on many subjects: history, economics, politics, but this process will slowly let you see that corporations and governments are nothing without their people or their consumers. They too are composed of people, with their trauma, doubts, emotions, just like the rest of us. Why do you think that the trade markets fluctuate so much? There are, in most cases, no direct technical reason, but the feeling of the investors. People get scared and sell, or get overconfident and buy. Then their actions create a trend that creates demand or scarcity, which drives prices up or collapses stocks. It is a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way. But to take this journey of discovery, you must know that you can trust most of the institutions of a democratic world. Not blindly, of course. They sometimes do become corrupt, have agendas, biases, but it's by interconnecting them that you can assert the truth. If the entire world's community of scientists, intellectuals, artists has an overwhelming opinion that a war is taking place, or that a virus exists, they are most certainly not mistaken. First of all, what is an intellectual? That fancy description simply applies to a person whose main resource is his or her intellectual capacity, and who uses it day in and day out to make sense of the world. Is it then wise to believe that all of those guys got it wrong, but Bob from somewhere deep in Arkansas saw right through the lies and got it right? I believe not. The result of an ideology that denies reality is self-destruction. Denying the reality of a drug addiction, for example, will kill you. Not believing that any cooperation for the greater good is possible is suicidal. Our entire evolution proves, on the contrary, that cooperation is the key of our common success. This is no wishful thinking. Trust in cooperation, science, and human values is practical and realistic, and the way for self-care. The common good is also good for the individual. The tragedy of the commons is an allegory that explains this point quite well. So, how do we do it? How do we fight the enablers of aggression? Well, we do not negotiate. We do not meet in the middle. Truth is not a matter of opinions. We put boundaries and enforce consequences for their actions. That's what we do with criminals. That's even what we do with children. In everyday life, that means three things. We support policies and politicians who fight to impose those boundaries. We acknowledge our power as consumers. Our money should go to the right pockets. Be mindful of how your commodities, food, energy are produced. Accept part of the burden. As I said earlier, it is by our own greed for cheaper products that we are financing corporate greed, which in turn finances the most inhumane regimes on this planet. Most of the countries that specialize in selling raw resources like gas or oil, or in mass production on assembly lines, exploit their population for the sake of a few billionaires and the power of the regime in place. Taking responsibility is also great for you. If I ask you, do you want to have a choice, a say, you would say yes, right? Well, responsibility is nothing less than responsibility. In other words, the capability to make a choice. And last, why hasn't NATO kept its promise not to expand? It is constantly hammered that NATO has expanded after agreeing not to, which forced Russia to defend itself. While it is true that after the 1990 reunification of Germany, NATO did expand several times by accepting new members, no written accord of NATO not expanding has ever been signed. The NATO representatives back then, Hans-Dietrich Genscher and James Baker, informally committed to not enlarge NATO east of Eastern Germany. But even if we take this verbal accord in consideration, it is almost 10 years later, in 1999, that the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland joined, frightened by many Russians' military actions, such as the First Chechen War, the Transnistria War, and the war in Abkhazia, to ensure their territorial and national security. Let's also not forget to mention the small detail of the wars in Yugoslavia, Croatia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Kosovo, where 140,000 left their lives and which created 2.4 million refugees and an additional 2 million internally displaced. Even though no Russian forces were on the ground, Milosevic, the Serbian president back then, and the Serbian separatists, who were the core of the conflict, were very openly supported, financed, and armed by Russia. Does that remind you of Donbass, of Crimea, of Syria, of Chechnya, of Georgia? This is a long-term tactic of Russia. How many separatists should Russia support to foment war so that we see a pattern? One thing is clear: no one leaves the Russian Federation or even sphere of influence peacefully.